Paul McCartney. You won't believe how a boy with a guitar changed the life of another boy on a Liverpool bus, and how that small moment grew into a friendship tangled with music, pride, fights, and, in the end, a kind of quiet love. Paul McCartney. They met long before the world learned their faces. Paul was a few years older, already loud with ideas and musical confidence, the kind of kid teachers remember for being quick and a little cheeky. He'd grown up in a house where records and piano lessons were normal. Music wasn't a hobby for him, it was a language. When he saw a kid sketching guitars and practicing chords on the bus, Paul didn't see someone younger, he saw promise. He poked, he encouraged, he pushed. That push would help shape a career that would shake the planet. George Harrison. George arrived quieter, the shy type who spent more time drawing than calling attention to himself. School felt like a trap. He'd later call that period the worst part of his life. But his fingers told a different story, calluses earned in secret. An obsession with the sound of American records drifting through Liverpool houses. When he finally got the chance to play for John's group, he nailed a tricky instrumental, and overnight, the others couldn't deny his skill. Suddenly, George wasn't a boy. He was part of something larger. Their early bond was simple and real. Long bus rides into town, swapped records, jokes, and the reckless idea they could play for more than small halls. That shared hunger, the feeling that music could be an escape, welded them together. Paul became a mentor, sometimes bossy, sometimes protective. George soaked up lessons and, quietly, built his own voice. But fame changes everything. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles were no longer a band of mates. They were a machine. And inside that machine, creative power often felt like a limited resource. Paul's knack for arranging, his relentless ear for what made a record work, pushed him forward as a leader in the studio. He thrived on detail and perfection. George, whose soul had started to drift toward Indian music and spiritual practice, felt boxed in. When he wrote something from that place, music that came from deep personal discovery, it didn't always fit the agenda. He didn't need just another slot on the album, he needed to be heard on his own terms. You can see the tension most clearly on records like Sgt. Pepper, and in the hazy, transformative time in India. Paul treated the band project as craft, a brilliant, ambitious idea to be executed. George lived the spiritual side of the trip. He thought meditation mattered more than mastering microphonics. Paul joked about it. George took it seriously. Those differences weren't small. They were the first cracks that slowly widened. By 1969, things boiled over. Tense sessions, clipped comments, and a famous moment when George snapped and said, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." Imagine carrying months, even years, of disappointment, and finally blurting that out. He walked away from the group for a short time, 12 days, but that walkout marked a point of no return. Songs he'd been hoarding suddenly felt urgent. Lines from his solo work later would read like messages meant for those who had sidelined him. The hurt was real. Then came vindication. On Abbey Road, George delivered two of the album's most luminous pieces, Here Comes the Sun and Something. Critics and fellow artists recognized his songwriting in a new light, at last, applause that matched his quiet genius. For George, it was proof he'd been right about his voice. For Paul, it was a reminder that the balance of power had shifted. The band wasn't just his steering wheel. When the group split, both men went their own ways. George's All Things Must Pass in 1970 exploded out of the silence, a triple album full of depth and resentment and beauty. There were songs that nodded to old wounds and songs that sounded like release. Paul, meanwhile, pressed on with his solo work and Wings, chasing a different kind of creative life. They proved, separately, that life after the band was possible and brilliant, but the rivalry and old grievances lingered in interviews and private jokes. The decades softened some edges. In the early 90 seconds, grief and nostalgia pulled them into the studio together again, working on pieces of John Lennon's unfinished songs. The sessions were hopeful but fragile. Old patterns resurfaced. George insisted on an outside producer to keep ego in check. He'd learned the hard way that too much familiarity could make things brittle. They argued over solos and production choices, but somehow, finished tracks did emerge. They weren't back to being brothers in arms, but they were willing to try. Life, though, was not done testing them. George faced serious health battles in the late 1990 seconds and survived a terrifying knife attack at his home. Those experiences changed him. Paul showed up when he could. The old rivalry didn't vanish, but the two men began to show a tenderness that had been buried under decades of hurt. Paul called George "my little baby brother" in interviews after his death, a line that captures all the complexity. Mentor, rival, sibling. When George passed in November 2001, it was as if a chapter closed on the era that had started on those Liverpool buses. Paul mourned publicly and privately. He stayed by George's side in the hospital, and those final moments included jokes and a simple human closeness that the young versions of them might have avoided. Paul later spoke about a tree George had given him, a living reminder that sometimes gifts hold entire friendships in them. He'd walk past and whisper, "Hi, George." Small rituals like that tell you how deep the roots went. What remains now is music and memory. George's songs have a stillness and a spiritual reach that stand beside the best work of his partners. Paul's life is a testament to melody and reinvention. Together, their story is messy and beautiful. Mentorship that turned to rivalry, silence that softened into compassion, and talent that refused to be contained. So, tell me, what's your favorite George Harrison song? Do you think his best work sits shoulder to shoulder with Paul and John's greatest hits? Drop your pick and your take below. If you loved this retelling, like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind the music.